Hi, second grade. I hope you really enjoyed your spring break this past week. This week, we're going to begin talking about how to write our own fairy tales. I think this is such a fun thing to talk about because we can be really creative when we write these stories, and we can make up our own characters. We can be creative with our setting, with what we want our characters to be able to do. There's so much freedom when it comes to fiction writing, especially fairy tale writing. So I think this is going to be a really fun week to write. So first, I want to ask you, what is your favorite fairy tale? If you want, feel free to comment this in the comment section below. I think my favorite fairy tale growing up was The Little Mermaid because I always loved fish and mermaids growing up, and I love that there was a story about this. So first, what is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is a type of folk tale. Fairy tales often tell us a story of good versus evil that involve magical events and magical characters. So some things that we might find in a fairy tale that we read or that we might want to include in a fairy tale that we're writing are magical events and characters, magical objects, anything. And these can be so creative because we can make up whatever we want them to do. Another characteristic of a fairy tale is that it often happens in a faraway place or even a made up place. It has good and evil characters, and the purpose of these stories are to teach reader a lesson. Another really common thing that you might see in fairy tales are that they really often begin in phrases like once upon a time, and they really often end in phrases such as they lived happily ever after. So authors write fairy tales to entertain their readers and also to teach them a lesson. Fairy tales are classic stories that get told over and over again. And over time, a lot of these stories change to fit the audience of the people who are hearing or reading the story. So some examples of fairy tales are Cinderella, Peter Pan, Rapunzel, The Princess and the Pea, and The Three Little Pigs. And a lot of these also have movies that I'm sure you've seen if you've never read the books, but these are just some common ones that I thought of off the top of my head. But today, as I explain how to write a fairy tale, I'm going to be talking about the story Cinderella to give you some examples, since I think this one's pretty common. So let's talk about how you're going to write your beginning. The beginning of any fairy tale introduces our characters, so we're going to have heroes and villains that we really want to describe and talk about in our story. It describes the setting. The beginning sets up the meaning of the story. So the lesson that we want to teach in our story is something that we're going to think about before we even write the story. And our beginning is going to tell us what our hero wants. What is the hero's main goal in this story? So step one of writing our beginning is that we're going to decide what lesson our fairy tale will teach others. So fairy tales teach us important morals, such as accepting others who are different than us, or not talking to strangers. An example of this in Cinderella is that the moral of this story is to show kindness to everyone, no matter how they treat you. In this story, Cinderella has a lot of people in her life, such as her stepmother and her stepsisters, that aren't very kind to her. However, she is still very kind to everyone else. And it is her kindness that ends up winning the prince over and helps her live happily ever after. Step two of writing your beginning is to choose your hero. So your hero is really going to be your main character in your story. A hero is someone who your readers can relate to. It is someone who is kind and does good things. And it is someone who creates a positive change in the story. For example, in Cinderella, Cinderella is relatable because she's a pretty normal girl. She's not magical, there's nothing really different about her. She's just a normal girl who's stuck with a really mean family. She is also very kind, even when others are unkind to her, like I said in the last slide, and she works very hard to reach her goal, which is finding true love. Our next step will be to create our villain, and our villain is who makes this story and this goal really hard for our hero. It's who challenges our hero and who creates a problem in our story. So our villain is someone who tests our hero's abilities and makes life hard for them. They create a problem in the story that the hero has to solve, and they try to stop the hero from doing good or from getting their happy ending. So in Cinderella, the villains would be Cinderella's stepmother and her stepsisters, because they don't allow Cinderella to go anywhere, and they stop her from going to the ball and falling in love. Step 4 in writing your beginning would be to decide what magical people, events, or objects will appear in your story. So, magic is the best part of any fairy tale. Magic is what guides your hero to solve their problem and have a happy ending. So, the example of this in Cinderella would be a fairy godmother. Creating magic in your story might be a little tough, but it's easy if you just stop and think as you write, what if? What if my cat had magical powers? Or what if my bed could fly? Any everyday object, animal, or person could be magical in a fairy tale. Your fifth step would be to describe your setting. So, fairy tales are usually stories from the past, but it's really up to the author to decide when they want the story to take place. Your setting can be a magical place like a castle or a made up land. Your setting should always describe what the place looks like, sounds like, what it might feel like, and even maybe what it smells like. Remember, it's always good to describe something using your five senses.